But the brutality of the Yugoslav War left us with an aftermath that can only be characterized as individuals losing access to basic social and economic rights, fragile peace that lacks sustainability, and people not knowing where their loved ones are after the chaos of the war has unveiled. Instead of prioritizing the reconciliation of the region and the rehabilitation of the most vulnerable in the region, we see the ICTY to fully focus and fixate on the weakest form of quote-unquote justice, which is the punitive form. We stand for a more effective form of justice, a more reformative form of justice. We also value the betterment of civil society. Incredibly proud to propose. Before I get into my argumentation, a few points of framing and setup. First, what does our world look like? Our world is one where there are eight national TRCs in each country within the Yugoslavian region. They report back to one regional TRC. These TRCs are going to be implemented by a local decree with the help and support of the UN, similar to Syria and Lyon. Those TRCs are going to be non-judicial internal bodies created from the people and not to the people. We see those TRCs to be made out of three fundamental committees. The first is one that receives and processes applications for amnesty and conducting public hearing. The second is one that is responsible for compensating and rehabilitating victims of the war and the most vulnerable, similar to the RNR within South Africa. And the third and final one is a committee that is responsible for giving out recommendations in three different ways. The first is recommendations of reparation actions to be adopted by the UN and local governments that seek to help and reconciliate. The second is recommendations of prosecutions to national courts. And thirdly, publishing a joint historical record every 2 or 3 years to continuously update the historical record of the war and to not miss any details of atrocities or crimes that are committed. Second idea is what are the conditions of the amnesty that will be given outside of the House? We see three conditions. First, full disclosure on all atrocities or crimes committed and or witnessed. Secondly, the crimes that are committed will have to be politically motivated. An individual has to have a certain level of authority forcing him to do that crime in order for amnesty to be valid and to be granted in the first place. Thirdly and finally, agreeing on doing public hearings and giving our testimonies to the public and giving the public full access to the testimonies that are given by individuals who got amnesty. Thirdly, we think that the implementation of those TRCs is likely to be effective on our side of the House because of local and presidential decree, funds and administrative power that is given by the UN, and the fact that the commissioners of the TRC in the first place are likely to be individuals who are civil society leaders, are likely to be experts of diplomacy and reconciliation. Fourthly and finally is the fact that the kind of justice that we're explicitly following and pursuing on our side of the House is a reformative type of justice and not the punitive kind that ICTY supports. Our stance is victim-oriented. We don't think that victims get justice when they see a leader who's committed multiple genocide being put behind bars for 8 years. We don't think that that's the kind of justice that victims seek on our side of the House. When it comes to argumentation, 3 arguments. First, on how TRCs lead to better victim satisfaction. Secondly, on how we establish peace in the region. Thirdly and finally, on how TRCs on our side of the House achieve better governance in the region. When it comes to the first argument, we prove this in 3 ways. The first idea is compensation and access to mental health facilities. It's very important to know for a fact that the incentives of the UN to participate in the region will likely remain the same on our side of the House. We see any kind of financial support from the UN to be reallocated towards establishing the necessary facilities and to provide mental health support for victims and individuals who are most vulnerable of the war. And we also see direct financial compensations being given to such people. Secondly, we see support from NGOs and donors because of more information that we get through accessing more testimonies because we're able to record and report on more atrocities and crimes that are likely to happen. We accumulate records for such crimes and atrocities that happen. We get a better understanding and a better record on what actually happened. This is fundamentally important because it gets the region more attention from NGOs who will likely support the civil society. And with the fact that we get victim testimonies and the fact that we allow victims to access the necessary platform in the first place to share their stories and to share these experiences, this mobilizes individuals that are more sympathetic on our side of the House to support these individuals and to support the region and to donate to it and to volunteer in the region in a way that is supportive and in a way that benefits the most vulnerable. And also, the supportive NGOs will likely be more effective on our side of the house. No, thank you. Will likely be more effective on our side of the house because of the recommendations and records that are likely to be given by TRCs on our side of the house. Any NGO that wants to support and be active in supporting the region on our side of the house will have access to information and will have access to more details that is likely to help them and make the allocation of their resources to be fundamentally more effective on our side of the house. The impact of this analysis is that we get better approach towards healing generational trauma and establishing more efficiency in managing resources in the first place and allocating them more effectively towards empowering the civil society. Before I move on to my next mechanism, go on.
TRC relies on a passive system where perpetrators have to willingly come out and apologize. Why will it work specifically in the context of Yugoslavia?
We think that perpetrators will come out and choose to take the amnesty because they fear to be prosecuted in the first place. They see this as an opportunity to alleviate some of the prosecution that might likely happen to them. We see incentives for them to participate in the TRC, to take amnesties and to give out testimonies so that they could escape prosecution. Second idea, on a more accurate historical record, we have more witnesses on our side of the house that are testifying from civilians and victims because they do have the incentives on our side of the house to participate because of things like A, platform that is not available in the ICTY. Not everybody can actually go, not all victims can go and testify in the ICTY. Not every individual has access to such platforms. B, the opportunities to face their perpetrator and actually tell the story and actually have the perpetrator acknowledge the suffering that they have caused to them. C, access to compensation that is likely to only be granted in case of testifying and actually going out and speaking the TRC. And D, finally, the fact that we actually build more momentum to testify, because once individuals who are afraid of prosecution choose to step up and testify in the first place, we see that people on the ground are likely to become more committed and to get a certain level of momentum towards giving out testimonies they themselves, which will get us more valuable testimonies because these individuals are people on the ground and more quantity in testimonies in the first place. This means that we establish a better joint historical record in the first place that is likely to be written, which will help reconciliating experts and will give us the necessary perspective of different victims and different perpetrators. The second idea is that we actually get less toxic nationalism and media war. Less toxic nationalism because we actually now have better education, because we give people a better historical record on what actually happened. We focus more on heroic stories that actually show some initiatives of soldiers, for example, who are supportive to minorities or who are supportive to victims in the region. And we also get better testimonies that give us a better collective image on what actually happened. But what is fundamentally one of the biggest failures of the ICTY is the fact that they failed to manage the media war. On their side of the house, they have narratives that say that Slobodan Milicevic is a hero. On their side of the house, they have narratives that say that these individuals are actually not the perpetrators, but are actually the victim. Each country within the region is saying, no, we're victims. They're victimizing themselves, but they're not willing to stick to the fact that they were perpetrators at a certain point. Second argument is on the fact on how we establish better peace in the region because of the joint historical record that we get on our side of the house by focusing on heroism and public hearing. On our side of the house, soldiers will only kill and commit crimes and do things that are detrimental if they're incredibly pushed to do so. On our side of the house, we have less soldiers who have the mindset of going out and simply obliterating individuals against them because they do understand that to a certain extent they too are perpetrators and not only the victims in the case. This means that we get more possibility of peace talk, especially because of the social pressure that is likely to manifest on our side of the house, as we're seeing a shift in democracy in the region after the war. Over 200 political parties were established after the war, and with the less toxic nationalism that's exclusive on our side of the house, we bring more possibility for diplomatic and peace talks. For all these reasons, we're proud to propose.
Justice is a prerequisite to reconciliation, not an alternative. We are extremely proud to oppose. I'll do a few things in my speech. First, I'll talk about characterization. Second, some responses to Prime Minister. And third, I'll forward two arguments from Team Japan. First, on why we better achieve justice for victims, and second, on the achievement of regional stability. Before argumentation, I want to note a few things on frame we do not agree with. We think there are three major differences between the ICTY and the hypothetical TRC we must note. First, on the existence of punishment. The ICTY's main goal was to persecute the most important leaders who spearheaded the war. On the flip, the TRC's goal was to move on. They almost always granted amnesty to war criminals, meaning this TRC was also systematically unable to persecute individuals. Secondly, on who has authority in each of these institutions. The ICTY was created and is controlled by the UN to ensure fairness. It was established outside the region by a third party. The TRC, on the other hand, is created more locally, often by the new government. In this specific scenario, it would be difficult to choose where to place the TRC, but the point is, it would be done inside Yugoslavia. Thirdly, on the budget. The ICTY had a massive budget incomparable of that to the TRC, reaching 10 times the budget of most TRCs. That being said, I want to make a few engagements with the PM and disprove their claims. On the first thing, they talked in their characterization as how this is going to work miraculously, where you're going to place different TRCs in 8 different countries, and we're going to have one main TRC that's going to work. However, I don't agree with this because they never. I'm confused by this on 2 levels. Firstly, this is not going to work, right? There's no incentive for a Serbian to go to a Croatian TRC and confess. You're seen as a traitor by all your friends and family. You have to get on a plane, travel miles to Croatia just to apologize. But secondly, and most importantly, the perpetrators are literally in other countries, right? I don't see how this is going to work. This needs to be explained better. The second response I have, their first argument is about better victim satisfaction. I have 2 problems with this argument. Firstly, they never answer why people will come and testify in the first place. Their only response is that they want to escape persecution. But the fact is that when people do not come and confess in TRCs, they often get away with it with no punishment. Look at South Africa, look at other cases of TRCs. We think there's literally no incentive for people to come to TRCs. But the second problem they miss is that why people are going to accept their apologies in the first place. We're talking about victims who have been raped, who have had their families killed. We think it is impossible for someone to just accept an apology when they go to a TRC. They need to prove this from PPM. Moving on to first argument then, on how the thesis of this argument is that the ICTY provided better closure and catharsis for the victims who suffered from the war. There are 2 mechanisms for this argument. The first mechanism is that the leaders got retribution and punishment. Under the TRC, the victims got a tokenistic apology from soldiers. This was inadequate in curing the deep pain these victims experienced. There are 2 reasons why the apologies done in the TRC were seen as tokenistic. First, because the only people who went to the TRC were those who, for entirely selfish reasons, wanted to get amnesty. They didn't come to apologize because they felt sorry. They came so they could justify their action and show that it was politically motivated, as PM conceded. Those who apologized for selfish reasons did not make genuine apologies. But second, even if the perpetrator were to give an apology from the bottom of their heart, victims were likely to perceive this apology as tokenistic, as you envision the perpetrators to be inhumane. To these survivors, justice and resolution were unachievable by an insincere apology. It is cruel and wrong to say that a sorry could pay for the suffering these people had faced. In the comparative, under the ICTY, leaders were effectively imprisoned. I'll take it later. This meant that the leaders, the ones who were responsible for all actions were committed, were punished. Soldiers and local military generals were merely puppets of the leaders, cogs in an ever-turning war machine. We punished the real villains, we did it right. We placed the blame where it rightly belongs, and we brought justice for the victims. I'll take it later. The second mechanism is that ICTY brought justice even to those who could not speak out. In both worlds, many people were unable to speak out due to extreme trauma. There are individuals who went through such horrific crimes that they are unable to come forward due to humiliation and trauma. It is forcing people to remember the worst moments of their life. The people that come to court hearings are the brave ones, but hundreds and thousands have to scream in silence. For those people, the ICTY can uniquely achieve closure. Under the ICTY, we covered everyone by punishing the leaders who ordered the horrors. This means that when Milosevic got jailed, when people heard this on the news, all victims of his horrors could place the blame on him. They could point the finger at him. They all felt some catharsis and reprieve, even if the specific individual who committed some crime upon them was in jail. The ICTY gave everyone, including the most vulnerable, a sense of justice. The conclusion of my argument is simple. We protect victims, we give them catharsis, we give them justice. But before moving on to the second argument, I'll take your POI.
On your side of the house, the ICTY punished, there was an arbitrary punishment in which a 75 years old person was prosecuted and imprisoned, and Milosevic specifically died before the verdict. He died before found guilty. So how do you solve for this arbitrary prosecution?
I think you're missing the point, because the comparative on your side is you do not punish Milosevic at all. We think it is rather worse on your side of the house. Moving on to the second argument. The second argument from Japan is on peace. The thesis of this argument is that the persecution of the most dangerous leaders is necessary for safety and peace, which was uniquely achievable under the ICTY. The premise of this argumentation is that under the TRC, wartime leaders stayed in politics. This fundamental function of the TRC, which centered around not punishing, means that leaders went unscathed and could stay in politics. Why then would the propositioned world where leaders stay in politics have inflamed conflict and hampered development? Two mechanisms. First, wartime leaders and their ideologies would lead them to engage in massively harmful actions. These ruthless leaders who committed war crimes are going to continue this horrid ideology. This is because these leaders have to maintain a strongman leader optic to maintain, where they must be seen as consistent leader and one that will continue to fight. This is amplified especially in chaotic times like war. Leaders are therefore unable to change course or moderate. These leaders, the masterminds behind these mass massacres, continue to rule and continue to destroy. But secondly, even if these leaders moderate, the existence of these leaders in politics in of itself would have been harmful. There are three reasons why this is true. Firstly, nations in the Yugoslav region obviously feel antipathy and antagonism towards opposing nations' leaders. Secondly, major Western institutions like NATO and EU is highly unlikely to admit post-Yugoslav nations as they are seen as unchanged. This means that nations are unable to access a lot of the monetary and military benefits these institutions offer. Third, and finally, many economic powerhouses in the West, like America, are likely to never reinstate their socio-economic ties with these nations. The fact that authoritarian dictator like Milosevic continued to wield power was enough, but the leader's firm anti-West stance further exacerbated this. This all means that when these leaders maintain power, countries are less likely to negotiate trade deals, maintain regional cooperation, create economic ties, and improve post-Yugoslav stability. So the question is, why was the ICTY able to solve this? The mechanism by which we achieve solvency is extremely simple. We have jailed tens of these genocidal leaders. The fact of the matter is that people want change. The citizens' will is to create change. Therefore, new leaders will cater to this will. They created a new age of leadership, one that was more democratic and one that was more moderate. The empirical evidence is clear on this matter. Croatia's new leader democratized Croatia and stabilized regional conflicts. Serbia worked to democratize the nation and integrate with Europe. Slovenia and Croatia have returned to the EU. Serbia and Montenegro are candidate countries of the EU. This leads to the conclusion of my speech. ICTY allowed for peace to be achieved in the region. This is why we are able to compete here in Serbia today. Extremely proud to oppose.
Side opposition is supporting a world in which in the ICTYs, first of all, the punishments were not effective. We are seeing 75-year-old grandpas being imprisoned and prosecuted, and some of them died before having a guilty verdict. Milosevic died before being found guilty. And even when they are imprisoned in 5-star hotels. Prisons. They're not even prisons. There are hotels with television, with access to gyms, libraries, etc. So we're not looking into real punishment. On their side of the house, this punishment is an arbitrary punishment that does not allow the victims to reconcile and does not allow the victims to take their rights, their rightful rights on their side of the house. So what am I going to do in this speech? I'm going to do three main things in this speech. The first of which is rebuttal, the second of which is present my third argument, and the third is to show how we win this debate and how Team Japan needs to respond to us. For the first thing on rebuttals, on prosecution, they told us that we do not get prosecutions on our side of the house. We would argue two main things. First of all, that their prosecutions are arbitrary, they cost a lot of resources, and second of all, they're not really effective for the victims. For the victims, I do not really care if the president is in prison. I would really care if my rapist is acknowledging that he raped me. I would really care if my rapist failed to apply for amnesty to be prosecuted. If my rapist doesn't have the courage to apologize, even if he does not mean it, is way more important than prosecuting individuals who are not directly my perpetrators. We know that they've ordered these things, yet they're not my direct perpetrator. They did not rape me on the field. This other person raped me on the ground. This is what justice we're looking at. But second of all, on prosecution, on our side of the house, people who fail to apply for amnesty or fail to get amnesty, these individuals are going to be prosecuted by national authority, so we do not lose prosecution. On your side of the house, these are the individuals who are going to live without prosecution. Why? Because the ICTY focuses on certain atrocities, certain problems. Other people are getting out without any punishment. They're not being imprisoned. On our side of the house, we're focusing on the little ones. I'm not going to take it. Then we're focusing on the others. On the idea of corruption and budget, we've told you that the UN is going to participate and is going to offer help as they did in Sierra Leone before. So we're not talking about something that did not happen before, first of all, but second of all, the UN have symmetrical incentives to be part of this as they've initiated the ICTY. They have the same incentives to create peace, the same incentives to help the victims. On our side of the house, we believe that the UN is going to participate, so you cannot argue corruption, you cannot argue budget, because it's actually the same between the ICTY and the TRC. Moving into why the Serbians are going to testify in other countries. We're not saying that these individuals should testify in other countries, we're saying that these individuals should testify in their own country in order for them to get amnesty. So we're not looking into testifying in Croatia or other places. So what do we get then? Why are these testimonies important? Because on our side of the house, as we've told you before, we're creating a regional TRC in which it's getting the reports from national TRCs, and then it's pushing for a mega narrative that's collected from all the national TRCs. Moreover, on retribution, they told us that retribution is actually effective. We did not see how it's effective. We did not see how the people are satisfied. This is our status quo. In our status quo, there's fragile peace, there's still hatred, there's still discrimination. This is not, I'm not going to take it right now. This is not what we're looking for. And on why are they going to participate? Two main things. The individuals who are going to participate are individuals who are afraid of being prosecuted without amnesty, so they're going to participate. But second of all, societal pressure is going to push them into participating. It's a domino effect. When someone's going to participate, the others are going to participate in the fear of getting prosecuted, in the fear of societal pressure. But second of all, we would argue that the victims' participation is way more important than the perpetrators. Because if the victims are going to participate and they're going to testify, it helps them in reconciliation, it helps them in their healing passage. But second of all, these testimonies could be used for prosecution of individuals who did not apply for amnesty, who weren't granted amnesty. So I'm gonna take it right now.
Yeah, just to clarify your model, can the Serbian sect of the TRC grant amnesty to individuals who come to the Serbian TRC?
Yes, they can, but on our side of the house, these TRC commissioners are not going to be people from within the government. These commissioners are experts in reconciliation, experts in diplomacy. We might use help from other TRCs. We might, like Desmond Tutu in South Africa. So we're looking into experts in diplomacy, experts in reconciliation, and civil society leaders. So they're most likely not going to give amnesty unless this person really deserves amnesty, in which there's a criteria. And even in the slightest possibility of these individuals getting amnesty when they do not deserve it, if they're going to get amnesty, they're going to testify. So their testimony is way more important than your arbitrary prosecution. Moving to the second idea about peace, they told us that wartime leaders are going to continue. Well, we did not see this. The ICTY couldn't prosecute Milosevic until he was thrown from his power. So the same applies for us. On our side of the house, the only thing that's different, that we're pushing for more societal pressure in order to achieve change. But second of all, on peace, they did not show us how we achieve peace on our side of on their side of the house. On their side of the house, peace is not achieved. We're seeing military tensions between countries. We're seeing Kosovo and Serbia still now having their conflicts. So they did not achieve peace. What they achieved is a fragile peace that is not important. And moving on to my argument. My third argument is about creating better governance. First of all, civil society is going to be empowered on our side of the house and our side of the house only, because the NGOs and the commissioners are getting more power. NGOs are participating more when they have more knowledge about what happened. But second of all, commissioners are getting more power in our. These commissioners are civil society leaders. They are religious leaders like Desmond Tutu and like many others. So these individuals, when they are getting more power, we're improving the civil society, which achieves more democracy. If they're going to argue democracy, we would argue that democracy is better on our side of the house. But second point is delegitimizing mid-rank generals. On their side of the house, toxic mid-rank generals courts are going to stay in power because they're not prosecuted by the ICTY. On our side of the house, they're either going to apply for amnesty or going to be prosecuted. Either ways, they're going to be delegitimized and they're going to be thrown out of the government. So we achieve this in the worst case scenario. And moving on to why do we create better relations, international relations, less toxic nationalism. On their side of the house, there are narratives such as the only massacre that happened, the only genocide that happened in the Balkans is against Serbia. These narratives does not allow for international relations, and these narratives are exclusive to their side of the house. On our side of the house, we achieve less toxic nationalism through better historical record in which individual victims are participating in it. It's being written by reconciliation experts. Moreover, we also get better testimonies and records, because if I know that an ICTY is going to be established, I'm going to preserve the records, which allows me to get better records. So that's why we get better records. So on who achieve justice, we achieve more justice that's better for victims. On who achieves better collective historical record, we achieve it. And on who creates better governance and better civil society, on our side of the house, we empower all of these. So proud to propose.
The wounds that people have from the Yugoslav War are never healed with a simple apology. To the survivors, justice denied is a profound insult, a mockery of their pain and resilience. It is a cruel reminder that a world can turn a blind eye to their suffering. Proud to oppose. My speech will consist of three main aspects. First, some top-level engagement as well as clarifications, then on victims, finally on peace. Firstly, I have three main notes I want to make at the top that largely deals with a lot of their claims. Firstly, that proposition has massive burdens to fulfill in this debate that still go unfulfilled at this point in this debate. They have to prove to us that individuals are actively going to come to the TRC, and the deputy's 1 second response to this POI cannot stand in this debate. Proposition wants you to believe two main reasons why people are actively going to come to the TRC. They firstly tell you that these individuals want amnesty and fear persecution, then secondly on societal pressure. About the first one, I'm going to deal with this in two main ways. One, that people are not persecuted under the TRC. Second, that these leaders especially have very little incentive to turn themselves in. Firstly, people are not persecuted under the TRC. There are so many people who do not come to the TRC that the TRC and the national court system lacks the manpower to persecute everyone, which is why the tens of thousands of individuals whose amnesty proposals got denied in South Africa never got persecuted and walk free to this day. This means that people do not have to fear persecution in proposition because people are unable to get persecuted. But secondly, I also want to note that leaders have very little incentive to turn themselves in, especially because these institutions can massively be coerced by themselves. That the fact that there's a Serbian sect of the TRC, and that is the only organization to which Serbian individuals have to be accountable for, means that the Serbian leaders no longer have to feel accountable. They have so much power in this institution. The second problem analysis you get is to say that there's societal pressure. This is just wrong, because the prerequisite of societal pressure existing is for people to be pressured. For some people at the beginning to be pressured in the first place, we proved to you that nobody feels this pressure. The implication of the first clarification then is the proposition has to fulfill this burden of people actively coming to the TRC. The second clarification is that the fact that proposition wants to claim this idea of a multinational TRC that extends beyond borders is the entire downfall of their case. From Kantaro's speech, we give you three main reasons why this is likely to fail, to which the only response we get from proposition is to say, well, the incentive to create peace and to be good for victims exists in all of these countries. Two problems with this. Number one, each country has different ways by which they accomplish this. This is why the ICTY was especially functional. But also secondly, the ICTY was uniquely forced, while in comparison the TRC is voluntary. Nations and these wartime leaders who still retain power after the war ended have very little incentive to actively cooperate with the TRC, which is an institution that is coming out to get them. I also want to note that this idea of a multinational TRC, and especially the response to the POI I give them, is massively detrimental to their case. Because I asked them if the Serbian sect of the TRC can grant amnesty. They say yes. The problem with this is that there's massive bias that remains inside the TRC. This is why, for example, when you look at the South African TRC, 0 cases of war crimes committed by black individuals was ever persecuted because the leaders who they claim are experts, people like Desmond Tutu, were incredibly biased against white people, which means the TRC was only functional in one way justice, not multinational justice. I want to talk about victims now, but before that, POI, go ahead.
You're talking about punishing those individuals. On your side of the house, you were only punishing less than 161 individuals. On our side of the house, even if we do not get the big leaders, at least on our side of the house,
Yes,
they're
but
going
we
to be-
punish the right individuals. On victims, our argumentation tells you that the TRC and the victims get tokenistic apologies on proposition. We also tell you that many individuals are too vulnerable and a lot of individuals are unable to speak out, which means comparatively, uniquely, when we bring justice from the top, we can target everybody, we can bring justice for everybody. We get zero response to this argumentation. I think that this massively harms their case. Let's look at their argumentation you get from PM. They give you a couple of things. The first thing proposition wants you to believe is that the UN is going to spend a lot of money in these reasons, and this is going to help things like mental health efforts. Two things. One, in the history of the United Nations and the history of the TRC, the UN has never established significant monetary support alongside the TRC, and it has only been always through the TRC because the TRC is obviously out of their control. But secondly, even if you don't take that, specifically in this situation, in this post-Yugoslav society, it is unlikely that the UN does this because the TRC is dysfunctional. All of our other mechanisms are prerequisited upon this. Unless they can prove the functionality of the TRC, the UN has no incentive to drain their resources into this. The second prop claim you get is on NGO support. We agree. NGOs, amazing institutions, brilliant. The problem is that this is a comparative debate. There is zero analysis as to why NGOs are in any way unique. NGOs exist in our world as well. Thirdly, proposition will have you believe that they create a better historical record, but the ICTY is just as well able to gather information. But let's take their best case. Let's say they're talking about different kinds of information. Maybe they're talking about more victim-centric information. The problem with this analysis is that we prefer a world in which victims are unaware of what happened to their relatives, because we believe that this allows for better rationalization. It is better to have information hidden from you as it allows you to rationalize and deal with the trauma. Rather than finding out that your son was abused and tortured, you craft this idea in your head that he died an honorable death in the battlefield. Rather than finding out that your mother was raped and beaten to death, you believe she died peacefully in your father's arms. Imagination is the antithesis of depression. I finally want to talk about this case that you get from the intro, that these individuals can just forgive and move on because of the wonderful institution that is the TRC. The problem with this case is that forgiveness cannot happen. An apology cannot redeem a person who raped you, who abused you, and who basically messed with your entire life. Maybe a few people will forgive their perpetrators, but for the vast majority of individuals, you are not going to look a murderer in your eye. Once they say sorry, you just go, oh, all is forgiven, let me move on with my life. This victim argumentation is massively important because this argumentation is the only argumentation that holds any ground in this debate. The ICTY and TRC are just fundamentally not strong enough to create massive change in society. They're unable to do things that create massive scales of peace or massive scales of conflict. We think that the only large impact in this debate and the only impact that is massively important in this debate is on victims. Next, I want to deal with peace. Proposition has a couple of analysis here. The first thing is NGOs. I've already told you NGOs exist just as much in our world. Secondly, they tell you about mid-rank generals. But once again, there are two problems with this. One, that you get no analysis as to why mid-rank generals even come to the TRC. And second, that they're unable to prove the comparative to you, that mid-rank generals are not prosecuted under the TRC, that the TRC does not prosecute individuals. Thirdly, proposition tells you a case about finger pointing and how we uniquely bring this idea that we point fingers at each other saying the other person is wrong. The problem with this is that finger pointing is not against ethnicities in our world, but rather to wartime leaders. The ICTY specifically focused persecution on leaders. It did not label one ethnicity as the bad guy, which means finger pointing did not happen in our world. But I also want to flip this argumentation, because the finger pointing that the leaders did rather reduced ethnic division. This is to say that once you're able to blame the leaders for the conflict and say that they are the fundamental reason why conflicts happen and that they are the demons that manipulated others to orchestrate killings, that is when you can vent your anger. The conclusion of this argument and the conclusion of this debate is that Team Japan takes this debate in two main ways. First, we protect victims. This is the most important class, and this is debate winning. But second, we win on proposition's metric on peace. We do not think that the ICTY is perfect, but the TRC is a dysfunctional mess of prejudiced individuals that does nothing to solve the post-Yugoslav crisis. To absolve the traumatized individuals, or at the very least to ease their pain, the ICTY was absolutely necessary.
We believe that in this debate, side opposition was blinded by the idea of prosecution that supposedly satisfied victims as well as served the nation justice. We believe that, as they said, the only mechanism for them to prove this case was through the prosecution of these oppressors. We believe that their entire case neglected three core ideas within our speeches, which is, first off, we get a platform in which accurate history is written. This has a lot of benefits both on victims as well as the nation. Second, on the idea of closure and how beneficial it is for these victims' lives. And lastly, on acknowledgement of atrocities, which is fundamental in a way in which we allow these victims to feel that these oppressors acknowledge the oppression that occurred, as well as taking responsibility of all the atrocity that they committed. We believe that we win on two main points. First, on the idea of providing victim relief and the right to know, and second, on the idea of how we better deal with the aftermath of the war, and therefore we get better outcomes for the nation. First off, we agree completely with what opposition said, which is the goal of the TRC was never about prosecution. This was never a priority within our case. We believe that the prosecution that they were fighting for within their entire case simply did not work in the status quo. What we saw is that people on the edge of their grave are getting prosecuted for like 4 years after like 17 years of trial. This was a waste of resources. This was a long waited verdict that simply did not serve these victims anything beneficial, because these leaders were not put in a corner in which they had to confess for the crimes that they did. They still had legitimacy to deny everything they did. They still had the legitimacy to get out of jail and continue living their lives with a lot more legitimacy than they would have under Arsad Daoud, because of things like narratives that Milosevic was still a hero even after he was prosecuted, because the guy didn't even acknowledge the atrocities that he committed towards his own people. Therefore, an important note to highlight here is that even if we assume that something like this was very detrimental when we're talking about no prosecution, we still did not get full access to amnesty to whoever wanted it. We gave very specific metrics as to how the TRCs globally work. It was meticulous ways in which individuals needed to provide significant information. They needed to be cooperative with the court. They could not get amnesty as they pleased. They had to abide by certain criteria. Therefore, we do not see how their points on how these individuals can simply still walk freely is true. Even if we do not get their prosecution, we still believe that we win on a lot more, like delegitimizing these politicians, which I'll be getting into later on in my speech. But even with our worst case scenario in which prosecution simply does not exist under our side of the house, we have a lot more mechanisms as to how we benefit the people within our status quo, when we're talking about the idea that victims will not be satisfied if their oppressor continuously denies everything they committed to them, continuously sells out narratives in which they are not victims at all. We believe that this is simply an injustice that side opposition needs to concede to. On the idea of testifying, which has been a very contingent point within this debate, we believe that we get testimonies because of a lot of points. When we're talking about victims and normal citizens, a lot of individuals are very vulnerable when it comes to the ability of national courts to prosecute them. We are not only talking about leaders of nations or highest-ranking officials, we are also talking about millions who contributed to the oppression. If we are not getting the 5% of individuals that contributed to these atrocities, we are getting a lot more than they are when we are talking about less resources being spent forcing the truth out of these individuals, because of the idea that they willingly get up because they are far more afraid of prosecution. And second, on the idea of victims and trauma and how they will likely not get up and testify, we believe that a lot of individuals are filled with malice in which they need they need to face these oppressors, in which they do not have any other platforms under their side of the house to gain legitimacy and do so. We believe that the TRC provides an exclusive way in which these victims can raise their voices. On the clash of victims, then, we believe that we win this idea on three main points. First, on the idea of acknowledgement of oppression, they needed to concede to why acknowledgement of oppression is significantly fundamental when it comes to moving on from these oppressions, when it comes to these victims actually feeling the satisfaction, not just seeing these oppressors behind bars. When we're talking about perpetrators continuously denying responsibility of the crimes that they committed and delegitimizing the impact on the victims, and sometimes outright denying the occurrence of the crime in general, the comparative then panel is, under side opposition, we get the idea that they have the legitimacy to deny, they have the legitimacy to get in and out of jail and still gain power, when we're not seeing actual confessions and other people willingly exposing other commanders. When we gave you the analysis on toxic nationalism and how we decrease that, there was very specific analysis when we were talking about the dynamics in which individuals, when they recognize the existence of the TRC, they now want to protect themselves through exposing other criminals above them who have forced them to do atrocities that they did not concede to. When we're looking at the lack of confession and actual truth, we get denial of the oppression. This is something that is very detrimental for the victims' lives, in which they have been trying to fight for. When we're talking about victims, they won't necessarily care enough if the same oppressor simply denied the oppression that happened and still claimed innocence, even if he is behind bars. They needed to prove why the actual action of them being in jail was enough for all of these people to just nod their head and simply move on from the case and actually be satisfied. Under our side of the house, first off, we either get confessions in our best case scenario, and in our worst case scenario, we get a lot of people willingly exposing individuals because they can get away with a lot of things that they were forced to do, as well as the idea of wanting to move on as citizens who are also very affected by the war. But second, on the idea of closure, when we're looking at a mother who saw her son leave and never come back, she will wait 15, 20 years for him to come back, never knowing if he died or not. This is something that keeps them up day and night. This is stress that they cannot deal with, that they do not have mental institutions for them to go and seek help from. Under our side of the house, even if it is very detrimental for these individuals mentally to know about all of these things, in the status quo, we believe that it's very good for these individuals to know about the truth. First off, on the idea of closure, but second, very important, when we're talking about knowing what happened, knowing what others committed to the people you love, you can now hold them accountable. If I am living in a false reality in which the same oppressor I simply do not know what he committed to the people I love, I will not have the incentive to push for justice because I do not know that he raped my mother. I do not know that he kidnapped my son. These are all things that we get under our side of the house. Lastly, on the idea of compensation, which is exclusive, they tried to mitigate this on the idea that the UN doesn't have incentives and that NGOs are symmetrical. First off, the UN and the EU have had incentives to pump a lot of resources into the ICTY. When we're talking about $4 million spent on one case in the ICTY, we see the capability of pushing resources. We also see the incentive of actually securing peace. This is something that does not change under our side of the house. And when we're talking about NGOs, which is very significant, NGOs need an incentive to push more resources. When we see the actual transparency of atrocities, when we're seeing the extent of oppression, these NGOs have even more of an obligation because there's even more harm for them to actually interfere. We believe that under our side of the house, once these victims have an incentive to gain compensation, this is also something that gets them to testify. They will also get a lot of benefits when it comes to living their lives in better way. We have seen how they gain job opportunities. We have seen how they gain food, shelter. A lot of these things do not exist under opposition side of the house. Lastly, on the idea of politicians and government, both sides agree that the existence of corrupt politicians within government is very bad. But we are talking about powerful people and how they characterize them to not care enough. First off, we don't see why they will cooperate on either side of the house if they are saying that they have the power, they have the stubbornness, and they have the influence to simply not cooperate with the TRC. Why will they cooperate with the ICTY, for example? But second, we don't see how under their side of the house they do not have the same influence and the same power to highlight the best lawyers, the best team in order for them to actually win cases. And even if we assume that they do not do that, under their side of the house, trials spend 17 years to actually get a verdict. We believe under our side of the house, we get the truth, we get confessions. Very proud to propose.
This is a proposition team that will have you believe that people of the 8 regions will magically and suddenly be able to unite and cooperate with one single TRC. This is a proposition scheme that happily believes that perpetrators will willingly come and apologize when we tell you that in real world, most of the cases are simply going to go uninvestigated. And this is a team that believes that a simple apology is able to liberate so many of the victims that went through the strugglings on their own. This is a team that is simply ungrounded in reality, which is why we use this debate. I want to chat about 3 things in my speech. Firstly, on the implementation of the TRC. Secondly, on victims. And finally, on peace. But before that though, I want to make 3 clarifications at the top of my speech. 1. They say this is resource intensive under ICTY. 2 responses. Firstly, they never prove why this is actually bad in the first place, right? Because I think you are taking these resources from UN, which is quite well known for how much money they have. It's unclear to me why this is actually a bad thing. And I would flip this and tell you that it is I think that the fact that you use some sort of resources under TRC and ICTY is symmetric, and given that the local individuals, for instance Bosnians, don't have much money when compared to the UN, you are more likely to harm the old types of harm that they want to talk about on their side of the house. But secondly, I would argue that this ICTY being resource intensive is actually a good thing, because this means that the UN is actually going to use more resources on doing things like investigation and doing things like using resources to actually catch criminals, for example, which is why they simply cannot throw away this buzzwords of resource intensive and assume it will fly. We would tell you that this is actually a good thing. Secondly, let's take a look at the strategy of the prosecution team in this debate. They say, oh, this looks like NGOs and UNs. Not only is this symmetric, we in fact do it more better on our side of the house. Why? Because the biggest difference between ICTY and TRC is that TRC is locally driven by the people when compared to ICTY, which is driven and actually created by the UN. And therefore, if the Western countries actually invest in those kind of ICTY in the first place, they have the maximum incentive to actually want the ICTY to succeed to begin with, which is the exact reason why you are more likely to have things like NGOs and UN actually located in the region to begin with, which is why I think their strategy at this point in time is not standing. Finally, they say that the leaders are not going to opt in. The reason why this doesn't stand in the debate is that they don't understand how ICTY works. ICTY, under that, I think individuals do not literally get to choose whether to opt in or not. Milosevic, in fact, didn't opt in into ICTY, but he was still prosecuted because he was a war criminal. And in fact, what requires opt-in is the TRC on their side of the house, which is why if they want to talk about opt-in, it is work on their side of the house. Firstly, but before that, I'll take a point.
You were talking about these individuals not opting in the ICTY and the TRC. We've seen in many cases in the ICTY, many atrocities were not found due to destroying records and many other things. The investigation teams did not have access to many places because of these individuals. So on your side of the house, yes, you do not get these individuals unless they're overthrown from power.
Comparative. Firstly, let's talk about the implementation. All of their benefits that they want to talk about on things like recourse or more stories and information and perpetrators acknowledging the crime were contingent on TRC working in the very first place. We tell you two things. First of all, on feasibility, we want to tell you that the categorical difference between TRC in South Africa and this hypothetical the TRC that might happen in this Yugoslavia is that when TRC came into place in South Africa, the government was already against the discrimination there. In the comparison, for Yugoslavia, even after the war ended, Milosevic, the war criminal, was still in power until ICTY detained them. I think this answers the question from them on ICTY. They say, oh, it didn't work because Milosevic already died, right? No, because Milosevic was only able to be removed out of the office when precisely because of the ICTY actually prosecuted them and detained them, which is why I think we do the implementation better on our side of the house. It simply cannot work. But even if the implementation does work, we tell you that simply it's actually bad strategically for their side of the house. Sage tells you that for the Serbians, literally, if you can go to the Serbian court, you have no incentive to actually go to the Bosnian court, right? And therefore, insofar as the biases exist, I think you are much more likely to actually get amnesties. And insofar as a lot of the perpetrators are outside of the country, it is simply not going to work on their side of the house. Secondly, let's break the premise of the government's case, because they say perpetrators of the crime are going to willingly come. The first mechanism they throw is that they want amnesty, and I think Seiji tells you the reality that most of the crimes are actually under-investigated in the first place. But secondly, often the leaders have a massive incentive to hide it and hide the past information, which has meant that you cannot get the information on their side of the house. But third of all, I think the reason why you simply don't get prosecuted on either side of the house, even if you don't simply apologize, is because I think the burden is the beyond reasonable doubt. And when there's so many evidence and so many information, you simply cannot simply definitely prove that this person committed a crime 10 years ago, which is the exact reason why this person probably are not going to say sorry on their side of the house. Then they say social pressure, but this is contingent on this first mechanism. But secondly, even if there are social pressures, people cannot identify who is perpetrators or not. So I think this social narrative, the social pressure things does not stand. So thank you. But even if apologies do exist, we tell you that this isn't sincere, and even if it is sincere, victims simply cannot perceive this to be sincere, which is why their lack of response to our first argumentation hits them at its harshest. Finally, let's talk about victims. The first thing they say is that victims don't want retribution, they want acknowledgement that the rapist admitted that they admit the crime. Just notice how unintuitive that case actually is, because according to their logic, I kill your mother, and I show you the recording of me killing a mother, and I apologize, and then the victims are going to move on. That's simply so unintuitive, right? I think what they want is a catharsis, the fact that you are able to actually punish them and put them under bars and actually let them go into the same strugglings that they have went through, which is why I think this is a comparative debate. Second thing they say is that, justice is simply slow, and that under ICTY it's so slow. There's two responses. Firstly, this is untrue. The process by which we achieve justice in the ICTY is like cathartic in and of itself. The fact that Milosevic got sent in the detention center, and the fact that the victim stood up and explained what happened, the fact that a detailed investigation is being conducted in the first place is in and of itself cathartic for the victims, even if Milosevic is not going to be like sent into prison. But secondly, even if you don't buy that yet, it's at best metric, because the TRC can only be replaced after the war is over, as it is to address the aftermath and to move on. The ICTY started before the war ended. Furthermore, leaders were put into detention centers while waiting trial, which is why I think like ICTY can start before the war ends, which is why I think this is simply better. Finally, they say that, oh, you have more information. Sage already tells you that more information is actually a bad thing, because I think imagination of you imagining that your mother died like peacefully is able to actually give you solace. Finally, they say, oh, this is symmetric, right? But it's actually not, like, obviously it's better on their side on our side of the house. They needed to be a little bit more comparative here. Just saying that ICTY has some flaws in it is not able to actually win them the debate. But finally, I want to do some bit of weighing here. Even if they take on some levels of victims, the one mechanism that is simply not responded to at this point in time is this idea that a lot of the victims simply live under trauma, that they are incapable of actually going up into the court. But on our side of the house, when ICTY literally prosecutes one single leader, for example, who is responsible for a lot of the atrocities, that is at the point in which we are able to actually give these kind of catharsis to the most vulnerable victims on our side of the house. Finally, on peace, because I think at 24 minutes of side competition, they still do not respond to our second argument as to why the only way in which you can actually get those leaders out of the office is by prosecuting them, and under TRC, Milosevic would have still had power. For all of those reasons, we think we win under metric as well.
The proposition in this debate is very, very good at telling us what the problems of the ICTY was, because we agree, the ICTY was definitely not perfect. It was oftentimes wrong, it was oftentimes not very good at what it was meant to do. But the problem with the proposition is that they can never prove to us that the TRC was in any way better, because the TRC is a fundamentally passive system that is prerequisited on opt-in. This is the biggest burden the proposition had to fulfill in this debate, and this is why proposition cannot take this debate. I want to firstly deal with one clarification. Can people be persecuted under the TRC? They say yes, and they say they proved this to you through their model. Our response was that no matter how much you can model, there's a fundamental lack of resources, that you are unable to prosecute the tens of thousands of individuals who aren't granted amnesty, that this is backed up both by their examples and by ours, and that therefore fundamentally, tens of thousands of individuals are going to go unprosecuted even if they do not come and apologize, and even if they do not opt in into the TRC. The implication of this was twofold. Firstly, that this harms a lot of their case, which is prerequisited upon buy-in, but also secondly, that people are no longer going to buy into the TRC because they have no active incentive to do so. If you have nothing to fear, if there is no prosecuting awaiting you if you do not opt into the TRC, then you're not going to opt in to the TRC and actively admit what you did. With that said then, let's dissect this debate in two main clashes. First, on victims. Proposition throws out a lot of material to you. Let's cover each one. They say 4 things. They firstly tell you that institutions like non-governmental organizations or the United Nations are actively going to invest more resources into this area. Our one and simple response to this is that this is largely symmetric, if not better, in our world. That the incentives for the UN and NGOs to invest in these areas exist at the very least in both worlds, and therefore NGOs and their existence in these areas are symmetric. Secondly, they have the claim on how they get a better historical record. Our response to this is very simple, that a better historical record is contingent on opt-in and support, and that this is not only going to not be possible due to the clarification I gave you earlier, but also the fact that they create this institution across borders and create a multinational TRC actively hampers their ability to create a historical record. Because think about it, gut check this, right? Actively antagonistic leaders of 8 nations who were at war for a decade are not going to come together and say, this is what history was. We can agree on what the horrors that were committed during the Yugoslav War. Agreement is not going to happen. This multinational framing harms their case. The third thing you get from proposition is this idea on how they have more information. We proved to you that more information is a bad thing to no response from prop. The fourth claim is that the ICTY is slow, to which we say, well, the process by which we achieve justice, even if it were to be slow, which we also contest, is also massively cathartic. Finally, on apology versus leaders, we've given you multiple mechanisms, but I also just want to kind of gut check this, right? I don't think that a rapist saying I'm sorry is going to actively redeem a rape victim, but the person who commanded that person being sent to jail, being thrown into a jail cell for the rest of their life, that at the very least brings some amount of more catharsis. But finally, we win on the most important types of victims, because victims degree on the spectrum. People who cannot speak out, people who cannot gain justice in proposition's world, people who are unable to say, this is what happened to me, I need help, this is the type of perpetrator I'm looking for. Those people are the most harmed on proposition, and those people can actively get justice uniquely in our world, where we have top-down justice systems where we target the leaders. These individuals are the most vulnerable in this debate. These individuals get no justice in proposition. This alone is debate winning. But finally, the second clash on peace is obviously going to our bench, because they concede to us in this debate that leaders being in power is bad, and we proved to you from an unengaged argumentation why these leaders can uniquely be ousted in our world. I think that this argumentation alone can take this debate. Proud to stand on the opposition bench where we actually care about victims.
Elite supposed justice, it's a justice denied. This is the side that opposition is defending. On our side of the house, even if we do not achieve prosecution for the leaders, we're not looking for this, because prosecuting the leaders takes more resources and it's arbitrary, because it's not going to benefit the victims, it's not going to create any real change, because these leaders, when they were prosecuted, they were thrown out of power before getting prosecuted. So the prosecution is actually arbitrary. What's more important is delegitimizing toxic mid-rank generals. This was analysis that was never engaged with from side opposition. Moreover, what's more important, it's achieving closure to these individuals. A child who's waiting for his father to go back from the war is way more inhumane for him to wait without knowing that his father died 20 years ago. A wife who's still waiting for her husband to go back and to bring her something is way more it's way worse on their side of the house, because on our side of the house, by the worst thing, we achieve closure, we achieve the real reality that happened there. So I'm going to do the main things and three main questions in this debate. The first of all, who helps the victims more? First point of clarification, they told us that the NGOs are symmetrical. Throughout the debate, we've proved that the NGOs are not symmetrical. On our side of the house, the NGOs are more incentivized to cooperate and to work, because NGOs, when they know that there are atrocities that weren't discovered in the ICTY, that are getting discovered in our TRC, they're more likely going to create part of this. But second of all, on our side of the house, when we get the testimonies of the victims, which is exclusive to our side of the house, because on their side of the house, these victims do not have the needed platform to testify. On their side of the house, we have a small amount of victims. On our side of the house, we have a bigger platform for these victims. So even if the perpetrators are not going to participate, the victims are way more important. But second of all, talking about participation. On our side of the house, these victims are going to participate because they want to get the platform to talk about their problems. They're going to participate in order for them to get compensation. But third of all, these soldiers and mid-rank generals that are going to participate in the fear of getting prosecuted, even if there is not as much prosecution as we want to have, but the fear of the possibility of getting prosecuted is way more important, and it's going to incentivize many leaders, many generals, and many normal soldiers to testify. Moving into closure and acknowledgement, and why is it important? It's not simply about an apology. It's about not denying the atrocity, not denying the rape, not denying the crime. On their side of the house, these leaders are denying the crime. What's worse than a perpetrator going going free after telling the truth is a perpetrator going free because of a not guilty verdict after denying the truth, after denying the atrocity. This is side opposition. Moving into who achieves a more collective historical record. They told us a multinational regional TRC is not going to work. We've told you that they're going to cooperate under the UN administration, but second of all, why this TRC is way more important than anything from side opposition. Because on our side of the house, each TRC is going to provide their own report and they're going to report back to the regional TRC. This regional TRC is going to be responsible for as we told you before, this TRC is going to be responsible for providing a historical record that is being written by different POVs, and this is way important than anything else from side opposition. Moving into peace, they told us that they achieved peace. We did not see this. We're saying Kosovo is part of Serbia. We're saying the only genocide that happened is against the Serbs. These are narratives that only happen on their side of the house. On our side of the house, when the victims are going to testify, when the soldiers are going to testify, it's way more important than arbitrary prosecution of grandpas and imprisoning them, and some of them are not even in prison. So proud to propose.